I never wanted to talk about the Joker. For years, that has been a blind spot in my pop culture consumption, and not for any simple reason either. I was always unsettled by him, and while some could make the argument that that was the point of his character, I found myself avoiding any piece of fiction he was a part of regardless. I didn't see The Dark Knight until I was 18 years old, and by then I was already thoroughly convinced that the Joker was a character of his time. Fast forward to 2019, and Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of the Joker created waves online. In particular, people debated over the ethics of the movie. Unlike The Dark Knight, The Joker was written and released during a time where serious political and cultural turmoil became very present in online discourse. I just want to be clear that I have not seen the movie and I have no intention of actually watching it. However, when I researched the discussions online, I saw that both the left and the right were defending and criticizing the movie. Whatever the ethics of the Joker are, whether or not it reinforces violent stereotypes or criticizes systemic violence, is not part of this video. However, I want to draw people's attention to a piece of media that, in my opinion, makes a point about systemic violence without framing it as an anti-hero fantasy. So, you give me the Joker and I race you Heathers. Heathers is a 1988 dark comedy featuring Winona Ryder and Christian Slater. It follows the story of Veronica Sawyer, who, after getting sick of the antics and bullying of her best friends, the Heathers, aka the plastics of the film, fall into the arms of Jason Dean, or JD. And he's this white, rebellious teenage boy who rejects the system of Westerberg High. While the film was not a big box office success, it has gained a cult following and even inspired an underrated, gentrified musical version, a modernized and problematic TV show, and a Riverdale Heathers episode. To set the parameters of this research, I want to say that I am focusing on Christian Slater's JD and Heathers the movie. While yes, the plot of Heathers the musical is practically the same as the movie, it has distinct differences that, for me, changed Jason Dean's character completely. But that's for another part of the video. For now, I leave you guys with a burning question. Does your damage excuse your behavior? Before formally starting the video, I want to discuss the concept of framing. For the majority of the video, when I discuss framing, I mean it in the theoretical sense where, according to mass communication theory, happens when media focuses attention on certain events and then places them within a field of meaning, while mostly used in news and agenda setting. Framing theory is applicable to most forms of fictional media, as it relies on the concept of presenting a story as positive, negative, or neutral. This has mostly to do with the writing of the script, although there are times when the physical film framing, as in the composition and blocking of a certain scene, has impact on the message. We'll get back to that later. Now let's get to the whale in the room symbolism, Moby Dick. Heathers is told through the perspective of an Ishmael, aka Veronica Sawyer. It is written in a third-person limited point of view, wherein we see the world of Westerberg High through Veronica Sawyer. So everything we know about the story is influenced by the feelings and actions of our lovely protagonist. When Veronica begins her relationship with bad boy Jason Dean, it's framed as a breathless and whirlwind romance which inspired what can only be called as a teenage rebellion. Veronica, who is part of the royal family of Westerberg High, aka the Heathers, falls for the dark, brooding, transfery boy who stands up to homophobic and misogynistic assholes. Sounds good, right? Well, it's not. For no particular reason whatsoever, Jason Dean begins to lash out at the popular kids, killing Heather Chandler in cold blood. He switches the spit-riddled drink with some cleaning material and begins tormenting all those who continue to maintain the status quo. He frames it as a suicide and calls it a day. So, what do I appreciate about this perspective? This is actually very important to the framing of the narrative, because it allows us some distance for logical thought and frames the actions of JD as something negative through Veronica's eyes. The audience is more exposed to the horrors of JD's actions rather than the inner turmoil of JD himself, This gives us a more nuanced and unproblematic look at the terrible system of Westerberg High without implying that its victims continue to perpetuate the cycle of abuse. So now we're left with a very troubled picture of Jason Dean, but not a sympathetic one. This is because the film manages to humanize his anger without giving his outlets and actions any validation. We're not really meant to dwell on the tragic backstory of JD. Instead, we're meant to take his mother's death in stride and believe that the anger comes from a much damaged, twisted, and entitled mindset. The system didn't screw JD over. In fact, in terms of the high school hierarchy established in Heathers, he's pretty much safe from the antagonism of Heathers, Kurt, and Ram. He establishes pretty early on in the film that he's not someone to be messed with. And that's the thing. No one really mentally tortures him after that, except maybe his father, but that's not really touched upon in the canon. He's not affected by the major inequality of the Westerberg High system, and at times reaps its benefits. JD is all talk when it comes to stopping the cycle of abuse and the Heathers and Martha's popularity and privilege gap. His actions and inactions prove to the audience that he doesn't really care, and is a rebellious teenage boy by nature. In particular, there are 3 specific circumstances which I feel points out JD's apathy to hate the most. Not many people notice this when watching the film, but there is a scene where, after Veronica ditches her double date with Kurt and Ram, she meets up with JD, who just so happened to find her through stalking. The two have a conversation about date rapists Kurt and Ram, and in the background behind Veronica and in front of Jason Dean is Heather McNamara being sexually assaulted by one of the boys. The way this scene is framed reflects the toxic relationship of Veronica and JD and how their teenage rebellion does absolutely nothing. In this context, I use framing as a film term and not as a literary term, and what it means for both Jason and Veronica as characters. This scene shows how Veronica is willing to turn her back on and walk away from friends who need her help and are victims of systemic violence. At the same time, this scene shows that even if the violent acts of the system are made known to JD, he does nothing about it and just, wants to stay with Veronica. It definitely shows that he is not an ignorant and uneducated man, but rather is just someone who doesn't care about the actual victims of a system. At times, he even actively perpetuates cycles of abuse and stereotypes, which leads me to, while not as horrific as Heather McNamara's sexual assault, we see the way JD weaponizes the system against its perpetuators, Kurt and Ram, when he plans their death. He makes Veronica forge a note where the two profess their undying love for each other, and basically tries to humiliate them by making everyone think that they're gay lovers. There's a lot to unpack in this scene, but it boils down to JD not only adhering to gay stereotypes, but also framing a very real and very tragic violent act of self-hate and homophobia as something that's hilarious and humiliating. And for a moment, Veronica goes with it. Because, well, yes, she hates the hurt that Kurt and Ram dish out to the student body. Now, while Veronica's anger is valid, JD's feels a bit hypocritical, seeing as he stood up to the two boys in an earlier part of a film after they called him a homophobic slur. So what does this mean? It's that even if JD is willing to fight Kurt and Ram when they mess with him or Veronica, he's also ready to play their game and even share their internalized homophobia, making him not too different from the very people he hates. He also shares another thing, which is similar to both Kurt and Ram, which makes for my third and final point for Jason Dean. In the same way Kurt and Ram objectify the Heathers and Veronica Sawyer, JD continuously violates Veronica's personal space and consent. Though he seemingly stands up for her when she's sexually harassed by the two, and even helps her take revenge on Kurt and Ram, he simply strings her along and expects her to be fine with his methods and murderous ways. When she finally cuts ties with him, he stalks her, manipulates her, and even contacts her parents with a forged suicide note. The only way Veronica actually liberates herself from JD is by faking her own death, which isn't ideal. What fascinates me the most about JD's toxic relationship with Veronica in the movie is that it's never justified by the toxic relationship of his parents. I appreciate that the movie frames the relationship as something that's tarnished by JD's own anger and damage. I actually only appreciated that more after listening to the musical. There is a line in the song Dead Girl Walking Reprise that goes, "I wish your mom had been a little stronger. I wish she stayed around a little longer. I wish your dad were good. I wish grown-ups understood. I wish we'd met before they convinced you life was war." Which, while is lyrically brilliant, also does what the movie tried to avoid. It implied that because the world was against someone like JD, he turned evil and spiteful, when in fact the two ideas don't always connect with one another. As much as it is important to talk about how the system forces people into dangerous situations, it is also equally as important to mention that justifying violent and destructive behavior because of a person's damage is what white supremacists use to justify their school shootings. There is another character in Heathers who I believe had it harder than JD. She is constantly beaten down by the system and is driven to her breaking point multiple times. However, she is the only one in the entire movie who does not lash out to others violently, despite having the most right to do so. Here is Martha Dunstock. Here's the thing about Martha. While she's probably the most beaten down, tormented girl in Westerberg High, she doesn't continue the cycle of abuse. She still stays nice and passive throughout the entire film, and in the end accepts Veronica Sawyer's olive branch despite really not having to. During my research, I realized how important it was to have Martha remain kind. In one of the many different endings of Heathers that screenwriter Daniel Waters had, there was one particular version that stood out to me. Veronica asks her old friend Martha if they wanted to see a movie together, and then Martha stabs her, calls her Heather as an insult, and then the screen fades to black as Veronica dies and yells, "My name is not Heather, you bitch." You know, that doesn't work because it stands by the idea that the original Heathers wanted to debunk. That you have to indulge your damage and bask in violent rage in order to quote-unquote make a difference. In a way, this alternate ending validates the white supremacist fantasy that a child who is marginalized, bullied, and traumatized will turn to violence to solve their damage. In the movie, the violent white man goes out with a pathetic bang, without the support and love of the girl that he wanted to consume, or without the attention of the people in society. His death only means one thing. He relinquished his control over Westerberg High. However, Martha Dunstock, who had up until that very moment lost all hope and even attempted to take her life, accepted the olive branch popular girl and victim of the system Veronica extends to her. They turned their back on prom to watch a bunch of movies. And even if the world still has Heathers and Marthas, those two made an effort to end the cycle of abuse in Westerberg High. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this new video. It means a lot to me that I gained so many supporters in the past few weeks. I'm just really overwhelmed by a lot of things that have been happening on this channel, and even if it's a small step, we're really close to my goal of 1,000 subscribers. So if you guys want to see more of my content or want to engage with me, be sure to click the subscription button down below. I also have a coffee, by the way. It's linked down below, and I left there an essay on the new movie Dr. Sleep, which I absolutely adore. You don't have to buy a coffee to read it, but it would mean a lot to me if you did. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me what you want to know in the comments below, and I hope you have an awesome day. Thanks for watching. Bye!